Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bring you another really fascinating guest involved in creating a better tomorrow on some really unique fronts. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Wade Blair, who is head of virology and vaccine discovery at AstraZeneca. Dr. Blair originally did his Ph.D. in microbiology at the University of California, Irvine College of Medicine, when he was focused on coronaviruses like polio, went on to do postdoctoral research at Duke in the area of HIV, and has held positions of increasing responsibility both in areas of therapeutics and vaccines, including positions at major pharma players like BMS, Pfizer, Merck, Genentech, as well as several smaller biotech shops. Over his really impressive career, Dr. Blair has contributed to the discovery and or the development of several approved drugs, as well as novel molecules in late-stage clinical trials. These include the HIV protease inhibitor, atazanavir, the HIV non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor, doravirine, HIV attachment inhibitor, fostemsavir, the HIV capsid inhibitor, lenacapavir, and most recently, he also did some work in CMV infections with letermovir. We have a lot of really interesting themes to get into today, not just on the antiviral front, but vaccines, immunotherapies, a lot of exciting topics. We're honored to have him. Dr. Wade Blair, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Thanks, Ira. Thanks for inviting me.
Great having you. As typically we do, I would love to start things off by handing you the floor for a little bit, just to talk a little bit more about you and your background. You know, as I mentioned, you started off in microbiology. You were working, in the area of these coronaviruses and polio, and then you segued into HIV, really right in the middle of the early days of the HIV epidemic. Take us back a little bit. Talk a little bit about the beginning of this really interesting journey you've been on.
Yeah, thank you. So, I became interested in viruses when I was an undergraduate at UCLA as a biology major, and wanted to go to graduate school and work in virology. And so I did that, moving to UC Irvine, as you mentioned. Doing work in coronaviruses, and so working on, like you said, poliovirus, human rhinovirus, the cause of the common cold, and a number of other viruses in that family. And while I was a PhD student, it's when the HIV pandemic hit, and so as a virologist, we felt really motivated to get involved and to try to do something. And so that really was the genesis of my interest in HIV. And so often after a PhD, you do what's called a postdoctoral position. And so I did my postdoctoral position in HIV, and I moved to Duke to do that, working with a premier scientist in the field, Brian Cullen.
And after your postdoc work, you enter industry, and we'll be getting to what you're doing to AstraZeneca in a little bit, and obviously some of your work in these different domains. But talk a little bit about some of these different experiences, because obviously big pharma, small biotech, and everything in between. As we'll also get into, a lot of pharma companies have jettisoned antiviral discovery over the years, but nonetheless, you got in there when it was a very hot topic in most companies. Talk a little bit about how that sort of rounded you off. Let's say, you had the academic experience. Talk about what industry gave you at both small biotech and big pharma early on.
Yeah, I guess I'll preface that by saying that, as through my postdoc, I wasn't really clear whether I wanted to go into industry or stay in academics, and that's something that I was thinking heavily about. And frankly, at that time, I didn't really know much about industry. There wasn't a lot of information in the academic world. It's different today. There's a lot more information on what industry is like, and for PhD students or undergrads or even postdocs. But suffice it to say, I knew that after some of my colleagues had moved into industry that I really wanted to go that route, and it was really again born out of a desire or a motivation to try to discover new medicines. So not just do basic research, which of course interests me, but really it was just to try to help people. And again, we were in the middle of the HIV pandemic, and there was just a real need there and a real call for virologists to get involved. And so that really was the driving force for me to get involved and to move on to industry and try to discover new medicines.
And discover new medicines you did. And if we could stay on HIV for a moment, because clearly you got involved when things were just heating up. And I read in your the bio of the show in the intro that sort of everything you were involved in, protease and then RII, capsidase inhibitors, and so forth. I mean, here in sort of a nice little package basically shows the type of discovery and development that took a killer a couple decades ago and turned it into this. I don't say we cured it, but we're getting pretty close. We've had Dr. Diefenbach on a couple weeks ago from NIH, and the Gilead folks also talking about sort of this undetectable equals untransmittable. Talk a little bit about, sort of this, what you experienced, let's say, over those years of developing these important combination cocktails, understanding, single magic bullets, great, but maybe we need other approaches to deal with some of these viruses. And ultimately, are there things we can learn from that experience that we can apply to other sort of pharmacotherapeutic areas where we're not thinking in combinations, in cocktails as much as we should be?
Yeah, no, good point. So that was really, that the combination concept, at least from my perspective, originated in HIV. It's being applied to other areas now. But again, just because the virus mutates so fast that, the discovery of highly active antiretroviral therapy was a huge discovery. But then very quickly, it was determined or observed that if you throw one agent on it, the virus just mutates around it. And so really the discovery of multiple agents hitting multiple targets and really, some targets were more potent than others. And so having the right combinations was also really important. And so, I was involved in some of those, working on some of those drug targets. And then the other side of my career, what it really evolved to is really trying to discover new targets for the virus. And that's where we came up with capsid and some of the other targets. But in terms of, cancer therapies now combination, this was really applied to hepatitis C virus, which was another amazing scientific feat in terms of discovery to cure it, in a sense. But it really was following the playbook from HIV.
Mm-hmm. 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 What as we get into some of what you're doing at AstraZeneca, I thought an interesting place to go first. It was a really interesting review you wrote about 5 or 6 years ago now. It was entitled "The Current Landscape of Antiviral Drug Discovery," and in this paper, it's not just about HIV. You talk about HIV, hepatitis C, I think some respiratory viruses like RSV, and you basically talk about, hey, this is an area that unfortunately many pharma companies have reduced their efforts in, maybe gotten out of completely, but there's a lot left to do in terms of obviously interesting targets, in terms of long-acting duration products, and so forth. Take us into what you were doing at the time when you first wrote this paper, and it was part of pre-AstraZeneca, but then a little bit about sort of how some of the conclusions, some of the learnings from this period affect what you're doing now? And take us a little into antiviral discovery at AstraZeneca 2023.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, again, like you said, a lot of companies have gotten out of the space, and certainly that was certainly true pre-COVID era. When COVID came along, a lot of companies got back into the space. But like you said, viral diseases are, they're devastating. They're still highly relevant and highly important. And so it's nice to see that some companies are still invested in it. And so AstraZeneca is one of those companies. And the work we do here is really focused on what we call it's really more vaccines and biologics. So we're not doing small molecules right now.
Okay.
And our strategy is, or our tagline is, vaccines for most people and biologics or antibodies to protect the most vulnerable. And so what that means is we develop vaccines for the general population that has an intact immune system that can respond to the vaccines with immune response, which is what you need for a vaccine to be effective. And then for those folks who are immune compromised in some way, who actually can't respond to the vaccines, and this was a very important component of during the COVID pandemic, we provide essentially what one of the outputs of the vaccines is, which is an antibody. And so you can put the antibody directly in a person to protect them. And AstraZeneca is a pioneer in that space in terms of it's called prophylactic or protective antibodies that you directly give to patients. And so it was a really I think a groundbreaking thing that AstraZeneca did in terms of providing that for immune compromised and other vulnerable patients. And so that's what we're focused on now.
Excellent. And as we're on that topic of immune response and vaccines, what I didn't mention in the intro to your bios, as you go through sort of your extensive publication history in the literature and go into PubMed and search on Blair, a lot of other papers come up in addition to what you do in the antiviral space. You've worked in mRNA vaccines for solid tumors, and you worked on JAK inhibitors at one point. This interesting paper on programmed cell death and sepsis. So you also round things off beyond in sort of the triad that exists between sort of anti-infection, inflammation, and immune response. Say a few words about this, because there's extremely important parallels, obviously, between cancer and infections, and sort of this, I don't know, this connected continuum of all three is sort of an important story behind sort of where we are and where we need to be going in addressing some of these diseases.
Yeah, definitely. So I think what you point out, so I've spent a few years working in the cancer field. I spent a few years working in the immunology or inflammation field when I was at Genentech. And the the impetus for that really was, again, so I was a virologist, and as virologists or even microbiologists, we do have a working knowledge of the immune system, because you're trying to figure out how the microbe is evading it, and how to, and also capitalize on utilizing the immune system in your antiviral approach. But you're really not an immunologist. And I actually still am not an immunologist, but I wanted to spend a few years looking at that from the other perspective, from the other side. And so understanding the immune system more directly, and then how that ultimately could be applied, to combating viral infections. And so I spent a few years at Genentech working in inflammation, and just learned a heck of a lot there. Really helped build, my knowledge of immunology, which again helps the virology aspect of it. And then the other piece of that is cancer. So chronic viral infections and cancer are there are a lot of parallels there.
Yeah.
And in terms of evading immune responses, drug resistance, there's just a lot of parallels there. And so that was also helpful, and like you said, rounding out my growth as a scientist. And then I think the other piece of that is, beyond the pathogen or the disease, again, because our focus is on immune compromise, and this includes cancer patients as well as transplant patients. And so there's just a number of parallels and learnings that you can bring in terms of different angles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the the topics that's been kind of hot. Well, it's kind of hot everywhere, but especially here, whether we're talking about drug discovery or beyond drug discovery, interesting ag chemicals, or we even did a show on artificial intelligence and whiskey. But this whole sort of AI, machine learning, deep learning technologies that are, being promoted. Let's say, push a button and every interesting drug candidate that you want spits out of the computer. We're not there yet, but nonetheless, all pharma companies are making inroads here. We profiled Dr. Ola Enquist from AstraZeneca last year, talking about AI and machine learning sort of broadly in designing new drugs. What is your perspective on some of these in silico tools, specifically as it pertains to the area of infectious disease and antivirals versus just we did old school methods, right? In the past, we screened, we looked at plaque formations and counted cells in a petri dish. Compare and contrast here. Are you excited about these tools? And in what areas do you think they potentially have application for what you're doing?
Yeah, so I'll just preface this by saying that I'm not an AI or machine learning expert, but certainly we utilize AI and machine learning wherever possible, and we are excited about these tools. And again, I don't think it's going to replace everything we used to do, but it certainly is going to enhance what we do. And I agree with you. I'm a bit old school. I like looking in the microscope and seeing the plaques, viruses form on cells and things like that. But in terms of drug design, in terms of, there's a number of different applications that we're already using it, and I see it growing. But yeah, drug design, drug optimization, I think is probably where we're seeing a lot more dividends right now, and how to take something that you have some information on, and then use AI and modeling to actually enhance the activity or some other property of a medicine that you're trying to develop. That's being done now. In terms of de novo drug discovery, again, it helps. It'll help that process, but it doesn't replace a lot of the screening that we need to do at this point. But there's a lot you can do with it, and I think I'm pretty excited about where it's going in terms of helping us get better, get faster, in terms of what we do.
And thinking about the last couple of years, and sort of what the globe went through with the pandemic, one of the themes that has also been kind of hot the last year or so has been this concept of preparedness. Ultimately, how we can make our societies, our healthcare systems more resilient. A couple of the folks, I don't know if you had the chance to watch episodes we did with Senator Joe Lieberman and former Congresswoman Donna Shalala, who are part of this bipartisan commission on biodefense, where they hope to put together about $100 billion to create a wide swath of diagnostics and vaccines and potential novel therapeutics to be ready for the next time. Talk a little bit about your vision on preparedness, because obviously, you're creating the vaccines, you're creating the biologics, a very targeted mission, but is there a place for sort of broad spectrum I know the pan vaccines, pan antivirals, as we move forward to, God forbid, prevent or lessen the impact for the resilience team of what potentially comes next per spillover and this One Health team?
Yeah, and so, in AstraZeneca here at AstraZeneca, we are very involved in pandemic preparedness, and we do have actually collaborations with the U.S. government to do that. And so, again, there's a couple of approaches. And so what you just mentioned there is, one of the approaches is to develop either vaccines or antivirals that have pan activity. And again, that's a little bit difficult, but one might imagine, developing a molecule that has weak but pan activity. So there's something that you could start with and could hold off perhaps a pandemic while you develop more targeted, more potent either vaccines or molecules. And so that's one approach. The other approach is to really step up your surveillance efforts. And so really watching what's out there. And if we start talking about that, I don't want to scare people, but there's a lot of stuff out there that in animals in different parts of the world that could jump to humans, and so we're trying to also say, okay, well, what do we think are the most likely pathogens to make that next leap? And obviously one of those is pandemic flu that we watch very carefully. And we do have a program with the Department of Defense in developing vaccines for that, now. So there's really two angles there, that two types of approaches that we would take.
What I noticed that you've been getting out a little bit on sort of the conference lecture circuit, talking about what's going on in terms of AZ, but also sort of novel approaches to antivirals. Anything coming up in terms of conferences for 2023 as we get into 2024, meetings, places that we could run into and meet you and listen to you? Anything else on the calendar that we should know about while we have you?
Yeah, so there's a number of conferences next year, and I think so we don't have anything scheduled, in terms of at least myself, giving lectures, but I will be giving talks on some of our newer vaccine technologies, probably early next year, and once we're ready to talk about it. But yeah, we go to a lot of the RNA-based vaccine conferences, a lot of the infection conferences, where AstraZeneca has a presence at all of these, and we typically have presentations from multiple members in the department that are that present at these conferences. So if you're interested, we could keep you informed.
Excellent. No, it's yeah, as I mentioned, it's a really interesting portfolio that you've been involved in creating over your career on both the small molecule front and now the biologics, and obviously the crossover between the infectious disease and the immune system. Obviously, very very timely for everything that's happening in this space, especially with immuno-oncology. So a very exciting time. It's going to be fun to continue to follow you and what you're up to. Any final messages, anything I missed for our audience, either per you, AZ, or any other initiatives that I overlooked prior to the show, please?
Yeah, no, I think just a couple of things that you highlighted that I can, maybe re-emphasize. And I think first of all, I have a passion for virology, a passion for infectious diseases, and so certainly just want to reinforce the message that it's really important, for companies and other funding institutions to stay involved. Hopefully, it doesn't take another pandemic to make people realize that you do need virologists. So, and then the other point you make about pandemic preparedness, I think, again, and that's really a worthwhile effort. It's better to get ahead of things and be prepared for things on many fronts than to try to scramble and respond to them, after the fact. So, those are two things that I'd like to reemphasize.
Absolutely.
And then I think also just I just encourage the younger folks to take an interest in science. There's a lot of cool stuff out there. As you've highlighted in your podcast, but just in general, science is cool. It's a lot of fun, and you do a lot of good as well. So
I agree that science is cool, and it's scientists like you are really cool, and that's why I love to profile you. Really great work, Wade, and look forward to staying in touch and potentially doing follow up. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this particular episode of our show across the various podcast networks, or if you're going to be watching here on our YouTube channel, again, you've been listening to Dr. Wade Blair, head of virology and vaccine discovery, AstraZeneca Pharmaceuticals. Wade, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule for a little while to come talk to us about what you've been doing, what you're up to now. Obviously, thank you for doing it. And as we like to say here on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow via the type of work you do. It's extremely important and very timely. And again, thanks for doing it.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to chat with you.
Great having you.
Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bring you another really fascinating guest involved in creating a better tomorrow on some really unique fronts. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Wade Blair, who is head of virology and vaccine discovery at AstraZeneca. Dr. Blair originally did his Ph.D. in microbiology at the University of California, Irvine College of Medicine, when he was focused on coronaviruses like polio, went on to do postdoctoral research at Duke in the area of HIV, and has held positions of increasing responsibility both in areas of therapeutics and vaccines, including positions at major pharma players like BMS, Pfizer, Merck, Genentech, as well as several smaller biotech shops. Over his really impressive career, Dr. Blair has contributed to the discovery and or the development of several approved drugs, as well as novel molecules in late-stage clinical trials. These include the HIV protease inhibitor, atazanavir, the HIV non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor, doravirine, HIV attachment inhibitor, fostemsavir, the HIV capsid inhibitor, lenacapavir, and most recently, he also did some work in CMV infections with letermovir. We have a lot of really interesting themes to get into today, not just on the antiviral front, but vaccines, immunotherapies, a lot of exciting topics. We're honored to have him. Dr. Wade Blair, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Thanks, Ira. Thanks for inviting me.
Great having you. As typically we do, I would love to start things off by handing you the floor for a little bit, just to talk a little bit more about you and your background. As I mentioned, you started off in microbiology. You were working, in the area of these coronaviruses and polio, and then you segued into HIV, really right in the middle of the early days of the HIV epidemic. Take us back a little bit. Talk a little bit about the beginning of this really interesting journey you've been on.
Yeah, thank you. So, I became interested in viruses when I was an undergraduate at UCLA as a biology major, and wanted to go to graduate school and work in virology. And so I did that, moving to UC Irvine, as you mentioned. Doing work in coronaviruses, and so working on, like you said, poliovirus, human rhinovirus, the cause of the common cold, and a number of other viruses in that family. And while I was a PhD student, it's when the HIV pandemic hit, and so as a virologist, we felt really motivated to get involved and to try to do something, and so that really was the genesis of my interest in HIV. And so often after a PhD, you do what's called a postdoctoral position. And so I did my postdoctoral position in HIV, and I moved to Duke to do that, working with a premier scientist in the field, Brian Cullen.
And after your postdoc work, you enter industry, and we'll be getting to what you're doing to AstraZeneca in a little bit, and obviously some of your work in these different domains. But talk a little bit about some of these different experiences, because obviously, big pharma, small biotech, and everything in between. As we'll also get into. A lot of pharma companies have jettisoned antiviral discovery over the years, but nonetheless, you got in there when it was a very hot topic in most companies. Talk a little bit about how that sort of rounded you off. Let's say, you had the academic experience. Talk about what industry gave you at both small biotech and big pharma early on.